Welcome, traveler. I'm Gustavo Nogueira from the Temporality Lab, and I'm here to invite you to read with me the second piece of our time studies group. It is a text called Black Quantum Futurism, Theory and Practice, Part 1, from Rashida Phillips. Introduction. Black Quantum Futurism, or BQF, is a new approach to living and experiencing reality by way of the manipulation of space-time in order to see into possible futures and or collapse space-time into a desired future in order to bring about that future's reality. This vision and practice derives its facets, tenets, and qualities from quantum physics, futurist traditions, and Black African cultural traditions of consciousness, time, and space. At the point where these traditions collide, exists a creative plane that allows for the ability of African-descendant people to actually see into, create, or choose the impending future. From a multiplicity of possible futures, a practice of BQF allows a visionary to see into the future with clarity. Seize upon a vision of one particular future of your choosing, alter, shift, or shape it, then collapse it into your existing reality. It is the inheritance of a BQF creative practitioner to manipulate time, see into the future, and bring that future about. Why BQF over the present state of reality? Because a linear mode of time, which dominates time consciousness in Western society, does not allow access to information about the future, and only limited information about the past. The ways in which we are situated in time comes to be reflected in how we think about, talk about, and conceptualize the community, world, and universe around us. In a linear conception of time, which is built into our language, behavior, and thought, the past is fixed, and the future is inaccessible until it passes through the present. The present moment is fleeting but ever-present. Time is asymmetrical, unidirectional quality, however, is not an inherent or a priori feature of nature. It only appears this way because we have learned to order and make sense of the world this way. BQF is a new experience of time consciousness that binds modern-day physics, ancient African time consciousness, and conceptual notions of futurism. Though Black Quantum Futurism, we can increase the knowability of the future and the past by treating both modes of time as formally equivalent. This practice develops foresight and hindsight by studying features of time, sources of change, rhythms and patterns in larger social patterns, as well as patterns in our personal spheres of experience in order to map out our Black quantum futures. Time is change, and to see into the future is merely to anticipate what changes will occur and what patterns will reoccur. BQF creatives work to consciously subvert the strict chronological hierarchical characteristic of linear time. BQF definitions and quantum correspondence. The abilities of a BQF creative are rooted in established quantum physics, as well as practices inherent to Black and African cultural traditions, both ancient and modern. A theory and practice of Black quantum futurism alters the established order and informs the way we define the world. The language of the theory is thus guided by the phenomenon of blackness, futurism, and quantum physics, allowing for a cyclical dynamic process of each term defining and incorporating itself into the other term. The term black, as used in black quantum futurism, is not only referring to skin pigmentation, race, lineage, and cultural identity. The concept of black in black quantum futures encompasses each of those complicated phenomena, but it also refers to the blackness that permeates deep space, what is commonly known as dark matter. It encompasses the blackness or darkness that permeates mental space and inner space. It refers to the light-absorbing darkness of melanin and the speed of darkness which surpasses that of light by not needing to move at all. Future, as used throughout this essay, does not rely on a specified distance, if you will, into the future. The future is relative and never forward-moving point, and can be as spaced out or as close as one chooses to define it. For example, the next second, the next day, and the next decade. Before we lived through yesterday and found ourselves in today, the future was today. Most people are adverse to or simply unable to form any significant connection to their far or even near future selves because they believe that the future, near or far, has no bearing upon their present actions. However, this privileged point of the present must be disavowed of this notion. The truth is the future, both near and far, is currently impacting upon your present, now currently reaching back from its position to meet you and create your present experience of a now. The term time, as you use it throughout this essay, should be treated as consisting of multiple dimensions. Not only the mechanical clock time or other classic and historic measures of time. In a book called Space, Time, and Medicine, Dr. Larry Dossey highlights the 4 dimensions of time experience as being 1. The present, short-term time, which consists of A, the perception of short intervals, and B, rhythm or timing. 2. A sense of duration, which consists of A, a sense of the past, and B, long-term memory. 3. Temporal perspective, which is the philosophical, social, cultural constructions of the world and their effects on the interpretation of time experience. And 4. Simultaneity and succession. Time, as incorporated into BQF theory and practice, utilizes and manipulates all 4 dimensions of time as outlined by Dossey. Futurism, alternatively known as futurology and future studies, refer to the act of theorizing or envisioning possible, probable, and preferable futures, much in the way that historical studies seeks to tell stories of the past or some approximation to the past as experienced by a privileged few. Futurism attempts to not only envision what is to come, but to understand what about the world is likely to continue and what about the world could plausibly change. Futurism seeks a systematic and pattern-based understanding of past and present, and to determine the likelihood of future events and trends. The most relevant practice and theory of futurism for the purpose of BQF theory and practice is Afrofuturism. Afrofuturistic concepts of sci-fi, fantasy, myth, and speculation bind both the past and future, delivering them to a now in visual, literary, musical terms, and any other mode of expression that one sees fit to attach the Afrofuturistic lens to. Afrofuturism is visionary and retrospective and current all at once. in that it recognizes that time cycles, spirals, or can be experienced in many other shapes and at varying rates. These varying time cycles can be attributed to the notion of the African unconscious, which apprehends rhythms and patterns repetition as intrinsic to nature. The same rhythms that order the stars and planets are the same rhythms that regulate heartbeat, breathing, and blood flow. Perception of these patterns and intrinsic harmonious ordering principles in nature led to the world's first calendars, zodiacs, and mathematics created by ancient African civilizations. The quantum aspect of BQF incorporates quantum physics, the branch of physics which studies the behavior of matter and energy at the atomic and molecular or micro levels of existence. The theory provides a mathematical description for some of the strange wave-particle duality. The theory provides a mathematical description for some of the strange behaviors and interactions that physical phenomena at this level exhibit, such as wave-particle duality, the ability of light to act as both a wave and a particle. Quantum superposition and has played a significant role in the development of many modern technologies. In the realm of quantum physics, observing something actually influences the physical processes taking place. A cursory glance of popular science websites such as phys.org and iflsscience.com show that much of the research and developments in science and technology these days is being done in the field of quantum physics, while use of the term quantum is being used in pop culture and colloquial language to characteristics like efficiency and sharpness, such as the quantum battery or quantum razor. This is indicative of our need as a society and global culture to begin incorporating quantum reasoning and principles into our everyday language and lives. Quantum physics has many parallels with ancient African traditions of time, space, and consciousness. In fact, ancient African traditions of timekeeping, cosmology, and spirituality have always encompassed and anticipated the principles of quantum physics. A chart on page 76 and 77 of the book roughly outlines the correspondence between quantum physics, African spiritual and consciousness principles, and collective reality experiences. BQF modes and principles of practice. BQF provides a framework for the ability to seize upon a vision of a future and collapse it into our existing reality. BQF Creatives believes that the future can alter the present and the present can alter the past through three modes of practice. So modes of practice characteristics. First one, future visioning. Through this mode of practice, you increase the knowability of the future by being able to see it with more visual clarity than normal. This mode involves little to no deviation of the future, just increased accuracy in visualizing it. With future visioning, you continue to live out the vision of the future already set, choosing the path of least resistance. However, you know with a greater degree of sensory certainty just how that future will unfold. Future altering. This mode of practice involves a narrow deviation from the present reality using what is already available and statistically probable in order to choose the future from a small subset of probable futures. Future manifestation. This mode of practice involves the greatest degree of creativity, allowing the practitioner to build the future up step by step, piece by piece. One of the essential qualities of BQF, allowing for future visioning, altering, and manifestation, is the phenomenon of retrocausality, or backwards causation, where the effect precedes the cause. An example of retrocausality in quantum physics is an entangled particle sending a wave backward in time to the moment when the entangled pair was created. The signal is not moving faster than the speed of light. Instead, it is retracing the first article's path through space-time and arriving back at the point where the two particles were first emitted. The wave is interacting with the second particle without violating relativity. Under this principle, the present state of the particle depends on both the future and the past measurement. Under a theory of retrocausal time, humanity has reached back to create the very conditions that govern our present universe. If we knew how a tree contracted into a seed, then we could predict the future. This is like saying that if we can understand the retrograde process of development, then we can predict the future. The future is always present as a seed. So if I know how a tree contracts to a seed, then I can also predict how the tree will develop from the seed. If we know the kernel point of a situation, we can predict its consequences. Marie-Louise von Franz. In my opinion, we do not see backwards causation in action, just as we don't actually physically see the present moving into the future, or the present passing away into the past. Our real sense of time passing is based on changes in our environment. In much the same way, backwards causation or retrocausality is not simply the exact temporal reverse of the action or experience. It is not simply forward causation rendered backwards. Retrocausality in the real world would not look like pressing rewind on a movie and seeing the action go backwards, the exact opposite of the action in forward motion. Retrocausality in action looks more like a rearrangement or reassignment of causation, with macro events and macro details, not an exact reversal of minute details and interactions. Mirroring the principle of retrocausality, the creative futures activated from a BQF perspective automatically reach back to redefine the present and past. A BQF creative exploits the fact that the future can alter the present and the present can alter the past, because it's not presupposed or inferred. When a possible future is envisioned, foreseen, or chosen by a BQF creative, that future will instantaneously reshape its relationship to the past. In quantum physics, the instantaneous reshaping corresponds to the principle of quantum entanglement. What changes in the future will be required to arrive at a present or a past state. What changes in the far future will be required to manifest a near future state. With retrocausality, we work backwards from the future to the past, which requires purpose and finality, where the purpose of any occurrence of interaction is to affect the future state. BQF creatives reach in before the moment nanosecond of collapse when future reaches back to blend into the present. African traditions of time mirror this principle precisely. In African time, time flows backwards towards you from the future. And I'm going to read again. In African time, time flows backwards towards you from the future. Dr. Bynum notes that some African religious systems also incorporate notions of retrocausality, where, for example, an Orisha or a Loa emerges from a higher state of consciousness and reaches back or down into local reality. The concept of recurrence is another essential characteristic of a BQF, which forms the foundation for the three modes of practice. Here too, we see that African traditions of time have always incorporated a notion of recurrence and cycles, which modern-day science is only now starting to recognize as deeply embedded throughout the known universe and in quantum phenomena. Physicist Paul Kammerer noted that the recurrence of identical or similar data in contiguous areas of space or time is a simple empirical fact which has to be accepted and which cannot be explained by coincidence, or rather, which makes coincidence rule to such an extent that the concept of coincidence is itself negated. BQF takes advantage of this universal rule by deeply observing and analyzing the recurrence of patterns, mapping those patterns, then using them to forecast or backcast future and past phenomena. The interweaving pattern of the two time aspects, that which does recur and that which does not recur, and the way that this pattern leaks into our perspective can be worked by a BQF creative to activate future visioning. In one of his lectures, renowned physicist David Bohm noticed that humans observe time as having two aspects, which aligns in part with the 4 dimensions of time discussed previously. On the one hand, Bohm says, we notice time as recurrence, the recurrence of the seasons, the recurrence of the days, the recurrence of the heartbeats, the process which recurs regularly and enables you to measure time in the first place. On the other hand, we also notice a contradictory aspect of time in that some things never recur or happen again, such that we will never experience 2 days that are exactly the same. We're never going to relive our childhoods or experience death or birth twice. Time then involves the interweaving of what is recurrent and non-recurrent. Bohm believes that these two contradictory aspects of time carries over into the way we experience and perceive time unfolding and how we divided up our thoughts into past, present, and future. At the point where recurrence meets or diverges from non-recurrence lies a critical moment in time. In the very next moment or point, we will notice a change in our environment, the moment at which something changes over into its next state. For example, the moment before I type the next letter in this sentence, or the moment before I read the next word in this sentence, which is a change from the moment before it where I hesitated and thought about what I would write or read, which is when we would notice a change in our environment. Philosopher Henry Bergson expounds on these critical moment points in his essay Creative Evolution, where he states that in order to advance with the moving reality, you must replace yourself within it. Install yourself within change, and you will grasp at once both change itself and the successive states in which it might be immobilized. Echoing ideas common to quantum theory back in 1907, Bergson stresses both the necessity of including the observer in the picture as well as the role of uncertainty and potential. In another essay called Matter and Memory, Bergson asserts that time and space are neither properties of things, nor essential conditions of the human capacity for experiencing things. Time and space, as he puts it, simply express, in an abstract form, the double work of solidification and of division, which we project upon the moving continuity of reality in order to have a starting point for action. In order to, in a sense, document and map out changes in our environment, we rely on time and space as the diagrammatic design of our action upon matter. In Bohn's lectures, he hints at a way of setting up new space-time configurations by finding the part of the experience which is before, thought. A BQF creative remains half a step ahead of that critical point in time, which can be described as the thought before the conscious awareness of thought, or the most minuscule moment in time before a change occurs in the environment. BQF creatives insert their conscious awareness within that space to consciously direct the point of change, exploiting the point in the pattern where change occurs. From that point, we can exploit time to slow it down, or speed it up, or break it into variable increments to allow greater degrees of access to the past and future than a linear mode of time would allow. Another essential quality of all three modes of practice is the development of the qualities of memory, feelings, and sensations that make up an instance of time. This is as opposed to the normal recognition of time as a mechanical clock hour. BQF creatives are adopting an experiential definition of time, where time consciousness can be altered at will. The rate and rhythm of time can be experientially lengthened to process information or events over longer rates of time, or constricted to process information or events over shorter time rates than that offered by our typical 1 second per second rate of moving through objective time. Using these modes of practices and principles of quantum correspondence, we can then move on to quantum mapping of our timelines. Mechanics of event building and BQF mapping. Early on in elementary school, we are taught to map out major events, world history, and even our own lives on a timeline that run from past to present to future. The timeline typically looks something like a straight line, with major events representing points on the timeline, where time moves forward and comes from behind us. Contemporary science also uses this concept, but instead calls it a world line. A, B, C, D. Past, immediate, present, future, past. The straight line moving from past to future also represents cause and effect, similarly embodied as a thermodynamic arrow. Cause and effect is a linear sequence of events A, B, C, D, where A causes B and D appears because of C. In this mode of time consciousness, intention is forward-moving and events are components of time, versus time being a feature of an event. The end goal, the end to be attained, point D on the timeline, is bound up with the present act, point C on the timeline, influencing it. It is not the past act B or A that is the end to be attained. In a linear sequence, we are most concerned with finality and final judgment, what a situation will lead or fit into. This linear sequence of time flowing towards the future and not the past has a built-in asymmetry in that D could never affect C, B, or A. Thus, there is no retrocausality and time does not flow backwards. As we explored above, and as quantum physics shows, these assumptions of asymmetry fail at the microscopic level. The asymmetry of causation is merely a projection of our own temporal asymmetry as actors and agents in the world, one that we have built into our language and our way of recounting events, and a probabilistic tendency at best. African notions of time and consciousness, when placed on a Western linear timeline, may look something like the image one, Sasa and Zamani. As Dr. Nikita Imani explores in more depth in the essay on page 31 of this manual, the past and present overlap in an African concept of time, as the present swallows up the future and the past swallows up the present. Your activity is what determines how quickly or slowly time moves, not a mathematically predetermined rate of time, where if you do not fit your activity within the rate, you either end up with a surplus or shortage of time. Time is not its own entity in the African consciousness. It is a component of events and an experience that can be created, produced, saved, or retrieved. Life is made up of events, and events are defined by certain relationships, patterns, and rhythms. Based on similar principles inherent to quantum and African futures of time, a BQF paradigm of time is assumed to be perfectly symmetrical, such as the way it is for the quantum matter and as it is in African time traditions, with varying layers and connections of cause and effect within the infinite possibilities for the interaction of potential and manifest matter. With BQF event building, events can be built from scratch. BQF creatives believe that at each point in space-time lies an unfolded potential of events. There are infinite space-time points, first activated by a birth event and continuing along the natural timeline. Space-times can be divided into smaller or larger intervals, or even redefined non-mathematically as opposed to the 1 second by 1 second linear mode of time that defines the rate at which we move into the future. With BQF event building, each sense impressions that normally makes up an experience's subsequent memory, so for example, hearing, tasting, touching, feeling, emotion, seeing, smelling, each sense impressions, like these examples, is taken as its own event and used to build an experience or instance in time. For example, see sounds as causes and events is say in BQF non-locality Zin 1. Using sense impressions as the essential building blocks of an instance moment of time, there can be an infinite number of ways in which sense impressions can interact to produce the sounds, images, and actions that make up an event experience. An essential interaction of these sense impressions causes a mini collapse event, unfoldment, which are similar in nature to wave function collapses that constantly and dynamically build up our moment-to-moment experiences of reality. BQF event mapping is the creation of a living map upon which a BQF creative can exert a controlling influence over personal experiences and personal time consciousness as a means of creating our own order and pattern in the universe, or unfolding and enhancing the pattern already present. BQF event mapping uses the principles mentioned in the previous section, future visioning, altering, and manifestation, to intuitively map out an alternative timeline for a BQF creative. The next moment can be built up, step by step, created by you, created from your own meanings, connections, relationships, hand-chosen and interwoven into the pattern of recurrence and non-recurrence. Time and space need not to be predetermined from pre-existing conditions. New configurations of time and space can be created simply by shifting relationships and their meanings. With BQF event mapping, the shape of the timeline, world line, may look something like circles within circles or spirals shaped, for example, representing recurrent events, synchronous events, and quantum connections. Through this method of mapping, memory is not attached to a specific calendar date or clock time, and memories are not formed in regard to a specific date or time. Rather, time and date are made a part of the memory, so it is embedded or weaved in and controllable in future memory. You can make a date of your choosing part of the memory, which means you can forecast or backcast events. Time becomes something remembered, not something that defines and predates the memory. Some examples of BQF event mapping are provided below and will be explored in part 2 of this essay, but you are encouraged to build, create, and manipulate your own BQF event maps. Using this method of mapping events, BQF creatives have the ability to affect distant states either directly or indirectly via an influence on the future factors upon which those states depend. It recognizes that the present state depends on both the future and the past measurement. Backwards causation is simply a rearrangement or reassignment of causation with macro events and macro details. Another form of BQF event mapping is borrowed from Chinese philosophy, as explored in Maria von Franc's essay. Von Franz describes the time consciousness in the Chinese tradition as being a synchronistic thinking, or a thinking in fields, where the question is not why has this come about, or what factor caused this effect, but what likes to happen together in a meaningful way in the same moment. What tends to happen together in time? The center of the field in this concept would be a time moment around which events A, B, C, D, E, etc. are clustered. These events form a grouping pattern around the focal point, as if the focal point behaved as a magnet which attracted certain events. Events do not have to be casually associated in the normal linear sense of cause and effect. The events express a quality of time in a now moment, with time simply being one quality of many that expresses a meaningful pattern. For this form of event mapping, BQF Creatives determines the center of the field, the uniting factor, and synchronicity around which certain events will be grouped. Events here again can be defined liberally and can include macro-level events, micro-level events, emotional physical events, psychological and cognitive events, and sensory experience events, to name a few. The BQF creative becomes the active agent in the synchronicity focal point, instead of time being the active agent defining the synchronicity. So the image 2 now is a focal point to events A to H that are around the focal point. In Volume 2 of Black Quantum Futurism Theory and Practice, we will explore BQF as applied to larger communities and world events. In particular, we will further explore methods for mapping out the futures of marginalized communities using BQF anthropology of consciousness, archetypal and astrological BQF events mapping principles to backcast and forecast personal, cultural, familial, and communal cycles of experience. BQF Volume 2 will also include research and writing focused on the collection and preservation of communal memories, histories, and stories. We will look at larger events, recurrence, and collective experiences such as race riots and map out their next occurrence in our communities using advanced BQF events mapping techniques. This is the essay from Rashida Phillips, Black Quantum Futurism, Theory and Practice, Volume 1. That is part of the book, and the pages 11 to 31.